All right, well, we will get started here so that we have plenty of time for conversation, everything. Very quickly, thank you, Amy, for being willing to jump into this conversation with us and introduce us to these concepts. Pastor Matt is in with the children. He is very excited to watch the video after this, or the conversation, the recording after we're done. Don't worry, it's not going anywhere else. But thanks, so I'll let you jump on in.
Thank you. Well, I'm Amy, if you don't know me. My husband, Marty, and my family's back there. Before we even start, we're going to be talking about refugees, obviously. And I'm just curious if anyone in here, I know at least one, who has actually worked or volunteered or have been friends with refugees in the past? A couple, got a few. Okay, awesome. It's just helpful to kind of know what background there is. And please feel free to jump into the conversation as we kind of go along. I'm going to kind of lay the foundation a little bit on why we care about refugees, what are refugees, and then we'll kind of jump into the ways to help. But since there's people who have never really known maybe a refugee, I think it's important to set that foundation. So Deacon Mark, if you want to change the slide. Deacon Mark. Yeah, I don't have a button. Okay, so what does God say about refugees? I think right from the start, it's important to acknowledge that refugees, strangers in our land, it's a very political topic these days. There's a lot of opinions, but I want to come at it as the church, not as politics, not as right or left, because I think what matters is what does God tell us that we should be feeling about people who are new to our land. And I have a few verses, but the Bible never actually uses the word refugee. It just wasn't a word back then, but it uses sojourner, foreigner, stranger. And I think that there is no doubt that God calls us to care for the foreigners, for the sojourners, for the refugees in our land. If you can see the verses, it says, "You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of God," or in the land of Egypt. It talks about when a stranger sojourns with you, to do him no wrong, to treat him as a native among you, to love him, and to never neglect to show hospitality. One of my favorite verses in scripture is the one I had up here before from Matthew, where basically God is saying, like, when you feed those, when you clothe them, like you don't even know it. They're angels walking among you. You've fed and clothed angels. And when he was a stranger, we back then welcomed him. There's just something really powerful about being the church. And so many refugees are coming from places where it's not Christian nations, people who have never met a Christian, people who have never heard the gospel. And to feel the love and the hospitality from the church is absolutely, can be life-changing. They assume, there's a huge assumption that every American is Christian. They just assume that because culturally that's how this country is presented. So you imagine they run into a whole bunch of Americans who aren't Christian, but they think they're Christian. And the way that they're treated makes them think this is how Christians are treating us. So when the church can stand up and be God's hands and feet in this world, I think it's just an incredible privilege. And that's why, that's why I'm excited that y'all are here today. That's why I'm excited that that this church, is kind of exploring this area of ministry. Mark or Marty, you can change the. So I think it's important also, given the politics of this, to know what we're talking about here. There are different categories of people who come to our country. There's refugees. So a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee their country because of war, because of violence, because of persecution. There's an immigrant. This is someone who chooses to leave their country for different reasons, but with the intention of settling in another country. There's asylum seekers. This is often what we're talking about when we're talking about the southern border. There are people who have fled their country for a whole variety of reasons. They have a credible fear of persecution, but they do not have any government standing. Their cases haven't been adjudicated. They don't have this visa or that status. So they're just kind of on hold. And then there's a migrant, and a migrant kind of moves from place to place, usually following the jobs and work. And so today we're talking about refugees, but I would hazard a guess that God calls us to love all these categories and not just refugees. A few just simple statistics to kind of see the magnitude of what we're talking about. There's more than 84 million displaced people in the world. That is a whole, it covers several of these categories. There are people who have had to flee for whatever reason. 84 million. 26.4 million of these, obviously that number changes from day to day, are classified as refugees. More than half of those are children under the age of 18. The typical conflict that causes refugees to flee lasts 26 years on average. So this is not a short-term problem. When someone flees their country, usually they're not going to be able to go back in a year or in 2 years. We're talking about a generation. And when a refugee does leave and they end up in a refugee camp or in some other country, and they register as a refugee and they go through a process to be resettled, they do not get to choose where they go. So we don't have a whole line of people saying, I'm in line for America or I'm in line for Germany. They get settled wherever the UNHCR decides they're going to resettle. And out of that 84 million people that are displaced, less than 1% were resettled in 2020. So you have I can't do that math in my head. You have a whole bunch of millions of people that are just displaced, basically long-term / permanently, and a very small percentage that are granted the opportunity to resettle in a formal way. You can go to the next slide, Marty. So what does that mean for America? America, the president, if you don't know this, the president sets the cap for how many refugees. This isn't a congressional, it's every year, whoever's president gets to set the cap for how many refugees are allowed into America. In 1980, which is kind of when the formal system that we use now was created, that cap was at a little over 231,000. Last year, the cap hit its lowest point at 18,000. Just because that's the cap doesn't mean that many people come in. So the cap might have been 18,000 last year. 3,000 might have actually made it through the process. The current cap is 125,000. If you don't count the Afghans, that cap would be nowhere near being met. In 2021, it would have been 10,000, 15,000, something like that. But with the Afghans, that number has changed. There are 10, they're called VOLAGs, voluntary agencies, but there are 10 agencies in America that actually handle the refugee. So when a refugee is sent to America and they're sent to a certain location, there's a very specific agency that does their kind of formal processing for the first few months. And every state is different. Ours here in Colorado is Lutheran Family Services, LFS. So as we talk about ways our church might get involved, you're going to hear me talking about LFS because they're the gateway for newly arriving refugees. We resettle Colorado resettles about 3% of the nation's refugees. It seems like a low number. Some of the reasons for that, partially it's cost of living here. So we have a very high cost of living in Colorado. And for a refugee coming in with nothing, we don't have a lot of housing for them. But a lot will choose to move here. They do have some choice once they're given America as their resettlement. If they have family or friends that already live here, they can choose Colorado, even though it's a much higher cost place to live. And a lot of refugees tend to settle in places that already have refugees of their nationality. So you kind of have hubs, right? Detroit, a lot of Somalians, like San Francisco has a lot of Afghans. They just kind of tend, because it's what you know, right? If you know anybody there, it's a lot easier than going to a place where you know absolutely nobody. And Colorado Springs right now, because this is a lot of people's interest, is expecting about 100 Afghans. I think that number is going to go up simply because we do have Afghans already living here that had either become refugees in the past 20 years or had left and actually immigrated here to work a lot with contractors. People who had been working with the US military in the past had already moved here and they're bringing their families. So I think that number could definitely go up. I've heard there's already like 70 to 80 here. Denver is expecting, I think, about 1,000. But they're coming into a system that is all of these VOLAGs and the agencies that work with them. They're just undermanned, understaffed, and underfunded now because that cap was lowered so much over the past few years. They lost their funding. So They were like at 20% capacity, and suddenly 80,000 Afghans came to America. So there's a lot of problems in the pipelines right now in getting them settled. And then just that number, you probably all saw it on the news. Over 123,000 people were evacuated during those last 2-3 weeks in Afghanistan, and over 70,000 are expected to actually formally resettle in America. Marty, you can change it. So why should we care? I think we should care because God wants us to care, first and foremost. I have a few stories that I want to tell. And the first picture, the little picture of the sign up there, is the Zatari refugee camp. It's in Jordan. It's about an hour outside of Amman, and it's the largest refugee camp of Syrians in the world. It's built for 60,000. At its max, it had between 125 and 150,000. Right now, it has about 75,000 people. And but in the city around it, Mafrek, there's another, I don't even know, hundreds of thousands of Syrians just kind of living in their own little areas. Like an apartment building will kind of be given to the Syrians for them to live in. They're not really interspersed as much with the Jordanians. But if you think about a refugee's journey, I'm going to use Syrians because it's what I'm more familiar with. So you have a war in Syria. They leave Syria, they flee, and they end up in Jordan. A lot of them, like millions of them, end up in Jordan. And in Jordan, if they want to kind of enter the refugee pipeline, then they register as a refugee. So odds are they're going to be in a refugee camp like Zatari, which is just this massive, sprawled out in the middle of nothing, in the middle of the desert, surrounded by barbed wire. And they're going to live there 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. They're going to raise their children there. And so I was actually in Jordan a few weeks ago, and I did not go inside the camp because it's very, you can't, as a foreigner without very special permissions. But I spent a day with the church there that is working with Syrians, and I met a family. They weren't living in the camp. They were living in a little apartment, no furniture, just some like mattresses on the ground. Husband, wife, 3 sons, 2 daughters, all school-age children. They had been there about 5 years. And so, we're talking to them. It turns out they're Bedouins. They're Jordanian Bedouins or Syrian Bedouins in Jordan. Prior to this, they had never lived outside a tent. So they had been shepherds in a tent in Syria. Now they're living in a concrete apartment with no job, because what's a shepherd going to do? But 5 years ago, when they came and they were in the camp at first, they were one of the lucky few that got the call saying, you can resettle to America. And so they were so excited. They did the whole process. They did the vetting, which takes a very long time. They did all the security interviews. They did everything. And they got the green light. You can go to America. And then the resettlement people explained to them how that was going to work. They said, you're going to come to America. We're going to resettle you in some state. And you're going to have 3 months of benefits. So for 3 months, you're going to be given whatever that is, that was at the time, let's say $1,700 a person. We're going to put you in housing. You're going to get your work permit and your social security card. And 3 months later, you're going to start working. And 6 months after that, or 6 months after arrival, you're going to start paying us back for the plane tickets for your family of 7. And you need to learn English because you're not going to get a good job without English. And you're a shepherd. What are you going to do in America? Don't have a lot of shepherding jobs. And they freaked out. They were like, better the thing we have learned here, like what we know living in this little, refugee or this huge refugee camp, then that will fail our kids. We can't do it. And they said no. And they kept calling, are you sure? Nobody turns down this opportunity. Are you sure? They said, no, we can't. The husband was like, he's this massive, 6'6", huge, just Bedouin guy. And he was like, I can't do it. I can't learn English that fast. And so 5 years later, they're sitting in that apartment in Syria. They have no passport. They have and their kids are in just a terrible education system. And so they called back the resettlement agency and said, can we change our mind? I said, nope, your spot went to somebody else. So there's these journeys that people take. And the church there is doing an incredible job of reaching out to Syrians in that community, but there's just not a lot of hope of things changing for them. The picture on the opposite end of it, the picture of me this is my friend Asma. She's Iraqi. They've been in the States for 12 years. And she came over with, at the time, her husband and her 17-year-old daughter. And every time I was practicing Arabic with her to just kind of build relationships, because I've been studying Arabic, she was practicing her English with me. And so throughout all of COVID, she was like in my bubble. So I went every week and we would just hang out. And she would cry almost every week. And she would talk about what they had in Iraq. They were a decently well-off family. Both her and her husband worked in various capacities with the military, and they had to flee. And, they got refugee status and they came. But she said, when they brought us to our apartments, we came to America and they picked us up at the airport and we were so just exhausted and stressed out and traumatized. And they brought us to our apartment and it had a couch and a table and, just this very bare apartment. She said, I cried. My daughter cried because all that we had lost, and our family, and just this sense of like, we have to restart our lives. Now we're adults, like we've had this whole life. And 12 years later, she's still struggling. So it's not a short-term thing. It's not just the airport and some pretty flowers in an apartment to welcome them, although that's important. It's the journey. It's the whole lifespan, right? I have another friend, Nada, who is Syrian. And she was my first refugee friend in St. Louis, where we lived before here. And she was a difficult friend to have. She did not want to learn English. She wanted help on everything. And, you're supposed to teach self-sufficiency, but she was so traumatized that she couldn't do it. She couldn't learn English. Their family had fled one of the, bombed out cities in Syria. But before that, her son, who at the time was 13, was arrested. He was caught up in something. The government didn't like him. He was arrested. They beat him up a bunch. They let him go. And his family said, get out of here. They're going to get you again. So he, as a 13-year-old boy, went from Syria. He ended up in Libya by himself. And then he got on one of those boats that you see in the news, and he crossed the Mediterranean. And he ended up in Germany. In the meantime, their family, they had like 5 other kids, they left Syria, went to Egypt, went to a refugee camp, and got resettled to America. 2 weeks after they resettled, he aged out of the system, the boy that was in Germany. He turned 21, and they were not allowed to add him to their paperwork. So he is permanently in Germany, and they are permanently in the US. And when I started hanging out with her, it had been 8 years since she had seen her son. So she was just so traumatized. She couldn't do it. She couldn't learn English. She couldn't figure out how to be self-sufficient because her mind and her body and her spirit were so worn down. And she'd been there, she'd been in the US 3.5 years when I met her. She should have been self-sufficient, but she wasn't because she couldn't be. She needed friends and she needed people to walk with her in that journey. Marty, you can go to the next slide. There is a lot that we as a church can do, and it can be so overwhelming to think of this gigantic thing. And I want to take a minute and I want to talk about the Afghans, because that is most of what we're seeing right now. I talked to LFS. Most other refugee resettlement is on hold right now. People that are in the pipeline that should be getting on planes here, they're not, because we have so many Afghans that are already here or sitting on military bases that need resettlement. And there is a huge opportunity in that to minister, to care. But I think it's also, I think that the church has stepped up in a huge way for the Afghans. Something in that story, something in watching the thousands come through on planes and knowing that they worked with our military, like it's kind of brought to America this like welcoming spirit for the Afghans. But I also want to remember that there's a whole bunch of other countries and a whole bunch of other people from other places that need and that God calls us to love in the same way. And so it's not a this or that, it's an and. It's the Afghans and it's the Syrians and it's the Burmese. Actually, a couple questions then. So 68% of refugees are from only 5 countries. Can anybody guess what those 5 countries are? You can just yell them out. No. Syria is one. Afghanistan is one. Not Congo. Not Haiti. Not Iraq. There are plenty from those places, but they're not in the top 5. Myanmar, very good. So we have Syria, Afghanistan, and Myanmar. I know. Okay, Venezuela, millions and millions and millions, and South Sudan. Those have the 5 highest. It doesn't mean that they're the 5 highest coming here, but they're the 5 highest in terms of numbers of refugees. And then almost 40%, 39% of all refugees in the world are hosted, so people live in, by only 5 countries. So 40% of refugees are hosted by only 5 countries. Any guesses what the top country is? Not Netherlands. Not France. Not the US. No. Turkey. But actually, if you count the Palestinians, which, because it's been a lot of years, but it's actually Jordan. But Jordan and Turkey would be your highest percentages. America is like drop of the bucket out of the total number. I mean, we've had a very consistent refugee program, don't get me wrong. We've had some high numbers, but we are actually pretty low down on the list of numbers of refugees taken in. So the big question of what can we as a church do? That's going to be dependent on our church. We have some different opportunities. It's really going to be dependent on how many people are interested, what they're interested in doing. We want it to be organic. I don't necessarily, I don't want to say, hey, this is what our church is doing. I think it depends on our giftings and our passions and our time and our treasure and all of that. So here are just some things. There's the very formal system set up by Lutheran Family Services. They call it cultural mentorship teams. It's a group of 5 or more people that come together and basically sponsor a family, like from arrival through however long. It can be a long-term thing. It could be years. Actually, IAC has multiple teams of this and have formed 2 teams for the Afghans. And LFS is loving churches right now because churches are stepping up like they never have before in forming these teams and helping actually, because some of the Afghans need sponsorship because like financial sponsorship because of their weird legal status right now. They're loving that churches are stepping up because they haven't had a bunch of churches knocking on their doors before this. And so these cultural mentorship teams can help in a ton of different ways. They can start from when the refugees arrive and are getting into their apartment in supplementing and helping make sure that the apartment is welcoming and is, clean and has maybe fresh flowers and, that kind of stuff. It's helping them know how to take the bus. I don't know of any refugee that comes over and has a driver's license right away, certainly not a car. So most of them are going to be placed in housing near bus stops, hopefully, and they're going to need to learn to ride the bus. I, for one, don't know how to ride the bus here. So it might be a learning experience for us as well in figuring out how to ride the bus with them. It is helping definitely with English. You don't have to be an ESL teacher. You can sit there and just practice words. You can I brought a bunch of baby books, some of our old baby books over to an Afghan family the other day, and they're going to use it for ESL because they're just simple words that a 1-year-old is learning or a 2-year-old, the animals, the numbers. It is teaching them how to grocery shop. I heard of a refugee family that was like, we can't afford groceries here. It's costing us so much. Turns out they were shopping at the local gas station. They didn't know there was a massive, like Walmart or, somewhere that they could get groceries for cheaper. So they were paying, $6 for a half gallon of milk at a gas station. Teaching them how to work the thrift stores. Somebody who loves thrift store shopping, taking them and they get gift cards for local thrift stores. So taking them to the Ark and teaching them and helping them get winter clothes. There's just a lot of opportunities. But the goal is the church is to build friendship. Yes, it's to help them with these skills so that they can live comfortably, but it's to build friendship and to be the hands and feet of Christ. And it's to show them a Christianity that is different from what they see on TV when they see America. That's the goal, but we can do a lot of helping through that. The goal is not to sit down with them the first time with a Bible to say, your Muslim God is wrong and my Christian God is right. But if we do it right, if we love them right, they're going to see that and they're going to ask questions and they're going to say, what is it you believe? And they'll say, hey, Allah got me through this. And you say, my God cares for me too. What is it like for you? And you have those conversations and it's exciting. Let's see, time. Okay. Another opportunity, there is a very sweet lady. Her name is Priska. She is from Central African Republic. So she's been here 4.5 years. And she came over first with her nephew, who I think is an adult, and then her sister and her sister's son came over. We had them at our house for Thanksgiving. And they're just sweet. They're just really sweet people working their tails off. Both Priska and her sister are cleaners. I think one actually cleans on the base, one cleans at a hotel maybe, making ends meet, but really struggling. And they just got awarded a Habitat house, which is amazing. They live in a really terrible apartment. And so there's some opportunities for our church in helping with her. She's been here 4.5 years. She's working on her English, but only in her spare time after cleaning at night on the base. And, there's opportunities if you're more like, I want to go pound a nail or paint a wall. They have to have a certain number of hours before they kind of get their house of volunteer hours toward the houses. Also, she has basically nothing nice to furnish this house when she gets it. It would be nice if she could just leave all her stuff on the curb that she has because their apartment has roaches and other things, and start over. So there's very tangible opportunities when that happens. I think they'll get their house this summer. And then there's always opportunities for refugees like her who have already been here for a few years, who still very much need ESL, who still very much need American friends. Most of the ladies that I hung out with in St. Louis had no American friends, not one. I was it. And some of them had been there 12 years. They didn't have any American friends. So they just need friends. So even if it's just, hey, can I come visit you? Can we hang out for an hour? Let's practice English. There are just a lot of different opportunities. And we might just have ideas as a church. Hey, I have a real gifting in this. How could this help? So yeah, I want to be open to the church and where the Spirit leads. And I think, Marty, can you change? I think it's just questions. Yeah. So we have a few more minutes. Questions, thoughts, things from your own stories. It is now open. Yeah. Yes, there are always opportunities for tangible donations. I was just meeting an Afghan family that my parents' church is sponsoring, and we said, well, what do you guys need? And they said, we need winter clothes. We don't have any winter clothes. We need, bus passes that actually have money on them. There were some like really, really tangible things that they needed. It can be a little hard to figure out how to like coordinate all of that. We need to, one of the ideas would be to like pick a family or pick something that our church is going to do and then like provide. So like whether it's like for this house, seeing, do we have donations of furniture or, things like that, or like winter clothes. Our church doesn't have like a depot that we can put stuff in. At least I don't think we do. So we need to really tangible say this family needs this, and then, okay, bring it all to Amy. Amy will do, or, something like that. But yes, those are the tangible things are needed. It's just the logistics of figuring out who needs it and how to get it to them without like ending up with just big boxes of clothing. But it is a need. Yes. Other questions? It's actually underway now. It just started in the past week, I think. So I know my parents were there like on Saturday for an hour or two. And I could easily find out kind of when they have days scheduled for needs. And I think the way it works is you don't always work on like that person's house. They have 5 houses that they award each year here in the Springs. And so each person who gets a house has a certain number of hours that are like donated and stuff. Oh, Marty knows. Okay. Oh, okay. So they're getting in hours on some of the other houses. It doesn't really matter whose house you work on because it's all accruing the hours so that she eventually closes on her house out of the 5 that are happening in the Springs. Yeah. So I see that there's training for LFS. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, the only formal mechanism, if our church were to pursue it, is this cultural mentorship team through LFS for newly arriving. The LFS training, it's like every Tuesday night for a couple hours. is handy no matter what. And I think that anyone who's really interested in stepping into this, it would be helpful. It's free. They'll do your background check and stuff. And then if you ever wanted to do anything formally with LFS, you would have the training. But for anything else, it is not required. And I think if our church were to decide to step into this in some capacity, we would probably internally do a little bit of training. I've done that before at my old church. I did kind of an Islam cultural aspects training. We have, some people here who have definitely worked across cultures. So we could provide that in-house. But the only time that LFS training is required is if we were to do the cultural mentorship. And so if you are interested in that, if you're like, God's kind of doing something in my heart, I might want to be part of what HTAC is doing going forward, then just email me or email Chris and he can tell me. But just so that I can help you register for it. It's really easy. You just do it on your computer at home on a Tuesday night. Yeah. So the IAC group, the most recent thing, they just took on two Afghan families. So they are doing the formal cultural mentorship team. So same as what my parents' church is doing, basically newly arrived refugee, most of them from Afghanistan are not in their long-term housing yet, they're in temporary housing. So you meet them, you start asking, what do you need? They're already in ESL classes. Well, we found out this lady is 4 months pregnant. She's walking 40 minutes each direction to her ESL class because they didn't place them near a bus route. And so for a little while, we're going to help with rides. So one lady's going, Monday mornings to take them. A different person's going on Wednesday mornings. It's not a long-term solution, but it's something short-term. And they're about to get their housing. So we're going to talk through what do they need for their housing? Do we have donations from that church? So there's just those are very tangible things, but they also have a couple families that they had gotten like 4 years ago that they're still in a relationship with, a Congolese family. So they're just like hanging out with them now. It's just friendship and checking in with them and making sure, most refugees end up like insanely underemployed because like Priska with the Habitat House, she has a college degree from the Central African Republic and was a professional there. She's a house cleaner here. She didn't have English a lot. And mostly it's in the Muslim culture, it's the husband that works. So these men, if they were working with like the Afghans with American military, there's a chance they speak English. Most of them end up working as taxi drivers, Uber drivers, in factories. The number of refugees working in like our chicken farms is crazy. Just places they don't need English. And so kind of as they're here longer, helping them think through, can we help you like get back to a place where you're not having to work 80 hours a week to make ends meet at a job that's a little more in line with your, we have lawyers who are working as Uber drivers. So yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Is job training part of the process?
Not that I know of, Rob. No. No, they usually have a career counselor at these VOLAGs, like at the agencies, but they're like to help them write a resume in English and then go get a job at a factory. So no, there is no job training. And I know that there's like needs in terms of that career stuff. If you know how to make resumes, or if you have like connections with restaurants, with, like helping with some of that, a lot of them come in and they're dishwashers, but they can do that, without very much English. At least they can start paying back their plane tickets to the government. So, any other questions? So you're welcome to come chat with me. I'm around every Sunday. And feel free, my information's on there. The church has my information as well. Feel free to contact me. I don't quite know how we're going to gauge interest from here, if we just want people to email me and I'll kind of start compiling, or
people want to email Amy in the short term, and then we can mark, we're going to send out a reminder this week. Send out something.
and we'll. Yeah. So I think what would be helpful is obviously your name and stuff, but also like, what is it that you like that God would like place in your heart as far as what you'd want to do? Because depending on that is how we'll decide, I think, as a church, what we want to do. So maybe an idea of like what kind of time you're like, hey, I could do like an hour a week of this, or like once a month I could go visit a family. And then, just what is God doing in your heart? And is there a way that you feel like you could minister in this capacity, and we will shape the church's future in this around that, around what we hear. So, all right. Well, thank you. Yeah.